All right, this is me wrapping up this week's Ethics of Care by Fiona Robinson. Again, I'm going to try to keep this fairly brief. But chapter four, we kind of jump right into it. And I think that when we start next week, whoever's presenting will really be able to kind of take a hold of Fiona's like next steps and what she kind of wants to do with in regards to global governance and humanitarian intervention, and then autonomy and everything that we're going to talk about now. So global governments, she describes it as it is necessary to look inside those broad understandings of the trajectory of global security governments in order to understand how they've created and perpetuated hegemonic discourses that I've efficiently silenced alternatives. While global governments is certainly shaped by struggles of non-state actors against the consequences of globalization, it is also defined by the discursive and material power of the world's most powerful states aligned towards the needs of gendered global capitalist economy. And I'm going to kind of let y'all read those yourselves. But a feminist analysis of the ethics of human security reveals the privileging of masculinized, individualist, universal ontological assumptions of traditional ethic approach is to global governments. So she's kind of talking here about global governance and how it has to do with, um, security studies that we've been talking about, and how it has this overarching power that obviously implements these protections and these security conditions, policies, etc., that we kind of have to stay up to date on, and how this global governance as it is today is again not ideal, like similar to these human rights idea where we're at like a stepping stone process at this point, like a level one, but what can we do to get to level two is what she's asking. And she goes on to human intervention seems to kind of be her answer, her solution to this problem. There's little recognition in the report of the need for innovative theoretical analysis and policy tools that are surely be necessary if lasting, meaningful transformation is to occur. So, she's saying at this point, like, if we want something to really happen, like at this point, it's not working. And, the transformation hasn't started. And we've been saying for like a long time, like it needs to start, and nothing's happened. So this is kind of where she gives that idea of like, until we intervene and we create like, I don't even want to use chaos, but you know what I'm getting at. Until we create like a message, and perhaps like and whether that be in a nonviolent or violent way, we're going to get into that. There like needs to be some kind of chaos or intervention that's going to create to get this global governance to notice us. She said this must not mean simply inserting a gender analysis into the existing theories and policies surrounding humanitarian intervention. Rather, it must be transforming existing approaches and practices based on ethics of intervention. She offers that military intervention may be part of the process. The primary problem to be worked out in the report is when and under what circumstances military intervention is legitimate and justified. And that really reminded me of the non, and it's kind of the first question I had of this week was like, what response do you think you would kind of have to this? Do you think it would be a good or a bad response? These circumstances are definitely interesting and they vary. And I think similar to Fanon, she's saying, possibly military or like physical violence is something that is necessary, but it's really hard to differentiate or to determine when that is applicable. She goes on to say, an ethics of care offers no prescription of determining when a humanitarian intervention is required. However, it reminds other states in the international community, as outsiders to the conflict, of the need to scrutinize and pay careful attention to the need of war in war-torn societies, and to employ the means necessary to help ensure that adequate care is received. And so ultimately, my little criticism here, and maybe you see this less so than I do, but I thought this was really interesting because I'm like, ultimately, how does that help? I guess is kind of my question. So she's saying like, this is important. The ethics of care is important when it comes to humanitarian intervention, but it can't tell you when, how, or why. And I'm not saying that it isn't applicable and that it's not helpful or useful. It just seems a little, like I said, hypocritical. I've said this about some of her statements. It feels a little like, oh, like here's what I'm offering, but I don't have the answer. And I always get a little, skeptical when authors kind of say it like that. But perhaps I, read it in a different way, and I kind of want to know what y'all think. So like, does that help? Is it useful? If it does, like how? If we're kind of unsure when care ethics kind of is required or humanitarian is required, then why are we advocating in the first place is kind of my question. And this is more just, a critical response to her. We then get into autonomy, dependence, and interdependence. We've talked about this autonomous man a lot. So this is kind of where, that idea would come into play. Feminists have argued that one of the effects of ontology has been to scare from view particular experiences of women who are most likely to find themselves in and through their relationships with children, other family, or friends and members of the community. A picture of the autonomous man does not only distort the experience of women, all people's lives live there, and at least during some periods of time, independent with those of others. And she kind of goes on, this is pretty much the same quote multiple times. But again, this idea of like autonomy, dependence, and interdependence, we talked about this at the very beginning of like every individual human being is always going to need help, like in some way. And that's why care is like so important, is because you can't go through your human life without having some kind of dependency. And I think this idea of the autonomous man, or this person who like doesn't need anybody else, is so, obviously has so much toxic masculinity derived from that, as well as like this idea of like women constantly need help, whereas men can do everything themselves. And, we could get into that. We could have a whole conversation about it. But once again, autonomous man makes its appearance, and I think it's going to throughout the rest of the book. And I think it's going to be interesting to see, what we have to say next week. Overall, and I don't think I actually meant to mention this in some of my other slides, I really liked the text. I thought it was really good. I thought she made some really decent points. My only criticisms were mostly that I felt like she was somewhat hypocritical, throughout everything. My other small criticism would be, that I felt like this was a feminist, like gender-based approach, and we definitely talked about cis men versus cis women, and for me that was really problematic. I looked back and it was published in 2011, I believe. So this was quite, a bit ago, I guess, but it definitely didn't discuss any other genders other than cis, and I think that was like the primary, basic, like binary way of going about things. And I think there was definitely room for adjusting and adding possibly not cis individuals, whether that be non-binary, transgender, etc. But that would probably be my main criticism, and I'm interested to see maybe if that comes up in the next few weeks, but I'm not expecting